He knelt in the cold and did not notice how the wind tugged at the ribbon on the grave. His fingers were clenched around a small silver bracelet, scuffed, dented, as if a child's laughter had once shaped it. Rain-flecked light made the letters on the headstone blur into a single gray weight. Around him the world moved in hushed ceremony, black coats, lowered heads, a whispering camera far off. He could name the sound of every foot on the gravel. He could name the face of every mourner. But for all of that, the one face he had come to bury was not gone at all. A girl watched from 3 trees over, from behind a tangle of brambles. She kept her breath even. She kept her hands in her lap. She heard the sound of his sobs as if they were happening inside her own chest. When he knelt and pressed the bracelet to his lips, she recognized the shape of the hand that had once tucked a stray curl behind his ear. Her mouth tasted of dust and long confinement. The bracelet had belonged to her sister, but she knew the ritual. She had become practiced at watching the dead weep for what they thought they had lost. They were not alone. The woman who smiled too easily near the flowers, Stella, half angled toward the gravestone with the proximity of someone who valued performance. The man beside her, Mark, kept his face carefully neutral, an expression crafted for those who profit from silence. Their laughter had been softer here than in the house, but it had the same color, the color of people who make plans in whispers and wonder at how easily the world obeys them. From the cabin out back, Isabella had heard them the night the fire was described as an accident. She had heard the word inheritance used like a tool. She had heard them tell each other over cheap wine and a ledger how the man's alarm had softened since his daughter's death. She had heard the instructions about controlling the staff, about reducing visitors. She knew, by the sound of their voices, the way they were trimming the world to fit the shape they wanted. "How long before he's inconsolable?" Mark had asked, laughing then, careless. "Not long," Stella had said, and the syllables had laid out like a verdict. "We'll fold the estate, we'll take the guardianship. He'll be too weak to fight." Isabella had learned the words poison and accident without understanding the medicine or mechanics. She understood only the intent. They meant to finish something they had already begun. She had learned to read the rhythm of their conversations, to map the way cruelty stepped from plan to practice. From a narrow attic vent, she had seen them whisper over lists and calendars. They spoke of a funeral as both business and spectacle. They spoke of ending him, slowly, while the town slept. He thought he held a grave in his hands. He did not. She had been thin the first time she saw him at the cemetery, smaller than memory would allow, as if the world had compacted her into a corner to be forgotten.
Her hair, once in a braid, fell loose and fallen with a wildness she had not known as a child. Her voice, when she used it in the house, was measured. But that day, hearing him plead to a stone she wanted to step from behind, she felt an ache so sharp for the shape of a father that, for an instant, instinct overrode fear. She slipped one careful pace forward, then another, until the scrub hid her breath, and the line of the crowd put a small shield between her and the men who believed they had already won. She had practiced passageways in her head for months. She knew which paths around the cemetery were least observed. She knew to keep to shadow and to listen for voices. When she heard John name her, whispering to the bracelet as though it were the last living thing on the planet, a new plan made itself in her mind like a seed pushing through dirt. He had come there to grieve as men are permitted to grieve, loudly and with abandon. To the rest of the town he was a ruined, solitary figure. To the cameras he was a tragic man undone. To Stella and Mark he was a vessel to be emptied. To Isabella, crouched and watching through the trees, he was the pulse at the center of the conspiracy. If they finished him, they would finish their chance for justice. If he believed her gone, he would stop searching. If he stopped searching, they would sweep his life clean and call it their own. Isabella had rehearsed 1,000 tiny refusals. Stay hidden until opportunity. Do not speak until there is a plan. Do not allow them to know you can be used as a bargaining chip. But when she saw his shoulders seize with grief, she remembered the nights the two of them had shared a cramped kitchen table in an earlier, different life, how his jokes had been small lights, how his hands had been steady while the world turned. The idea of letting him bury that light forever was heavier than any strategy. She would make a sound. She would move. She would risk everything for that one chance to look him in the face. She stepped out on shaky feet. The world rearranged itself in an instant. John turned as if someone had called his name from a distance. For a second, the wind convinced him of memory. There, half hidden in the branches,
Was a child alive? The bracelet slipped from his fingers and clattered against the stone. He rose as if time had snapped elastic and bound him back to motion. He moved toward her through wet grass, like a man who had been given a second, secret life. They met between the black coats like two small ships finding harbor. He reached for her and she closed the gap like a woman who had been starving for a single taste of home. He smelled of tobacco and rain. She smelled of dust and stale air. Their tears were the same currency. Words unspooled uselessly. Vows, embarrassments, explanations that could only fit after truth was safe. For a splinter of time, they were merely father and daughter, being allowed to recognize one another.
Then the world found its reasons again. The hush around them sharpened to surveillance. Stella's smile had a knife edge now. Mark's jaw tightened like wire. The two of them stepped closer, not yet needing to speak. Their plan had been compromised. "You shouldn't be here," Stella said, voice low and practiced like a person giving stage directions. Her eyes skimmed the gap between John and Isabella, assessing damage. "You put him at risk." He did not look at her. He looked at Isabella. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice a broken thing patched together with something like determination. "Yes," she said. A small lie. She might as well have said she was whole. They left the cemetery under a cloud of people who saw identical grief and did not see the fracture beneath. Stella and Mark moved like hosts shepherding disaster into performance. The town, primed for spectacle, did what it always does. It recorded, it offered sympathies, it asked no questions it did not already know how to answer. At home, behind the tall iron gates of a house someone had called a man's triumph, the arrangement of rooms felt like a map of control. Staff moved in rehearsed, measured lines. The household hummed with the quiet industry of caretaking and calculation. John and Isabella were shown into a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and lilies. There was a pitcher of water. A doctor who had been consulted by phone came and left with diplomacies made into prescriptions. The house agreed upon his frailty, and the frailty agreed upon the house. They did not speak of the plan the way lovers speak in conspiratorial whispers. There was no romance to it. It was a strategy worked over between two people who had been reduced to pieces and then put together again with a new purpose. John was to appear more ill than he was. He was to let the town and the press see a man sliding toward oblivion. He was to withdraw, to close himself off, to become precisely the man his enemies wanted him to be. It was a performance with purpose, to make Stella and Mark complacent and to buy time until there was enough evidence to shatter them. "How do I fake my death?" he asked once, late, in the study where the light was thin and the book smelled of other people's ideas. She gave him a look that was all business. "You don't fake death. You give them the chance to show their hand," she said. "You let them believe the game is won. Then we take everything they've left exposed." She spoke like someone who had learned to be precise. The words cut across his fear and folded it into planning. There would be recordings. There would be documents. There would be people who had been bought, people who changed allegiance when the tide seemed to favor them. They would be called and in the right time, in the right place, confronted. He would need to be an actor. He would need to be patient. He would have to feel the slow betrayal like a pressure against his ribs and not lose his center.
Outside the window, in the place where the world came and went, a man who had made himself smaller in the architecture of wealth moved quietly through his duties. He was called Marco. He had worn the family's badge on his chest for 8 years, had learned the names of the cars and the hours the different town officials preferred their coffee. He had watched strangers arrive and leave, noticed which ones avoided cameras and which loved the glare. He liked nothing, perhaps, more than doing his job well enough that no one noticed him at all. Marco had a way of folding his presence into the background, the way ink faded into paper. He polished handles, handed over keys, pulled curtains and pushed them back so a room looked both lived in and tidy. Children toddled into his orbit and forgot to cry. Over the years he had spoken to this house in the only language it knew, quiet competence. He had watched the family age and reposition itself. He had noticed how Stella's smile had sharpened, how Mark's visits had become longer, how prescriptions had arrived with less and less question. He had some small, private ledger of impressions in his head. A man who had once been a presence was growing thinner. A woman's eyes had the glint of someone who calculated for profit. He liked his work, and the quiet understanding that came with it, that attention, if given, could see the smallest things and sometimes prevent harm. On the day someone assumed a child's absence was a closed chapter, Marco moved like a person who had nothing to gain by noticing. He placed a car key in the tray. He corrected a coat with a brief, efficient motion.
A small motion like that, nothing for the papers, was an entire sentence of protection in his world. He had watched the family for years and was, in every sense, invisible. Isabella listened to their voices in the house and learned the grammar of intent. Once, months before, she had tried to leave in the night and been found and brought back. Once she had nearly escaped in a passage of rain and was stopped by a door she had not known could be locked from the outside. She learned to move only when she could be quiet as the wallpaper. She learned to watch the staff and to memorize their off-duty patterns. She learned the times the gates opened and who preferred the east exit and who preferred the west. Marco, in his unobtrusive ways, was a figure who belonged on her list, a placid presence with hands that knew doors. She noticed when he hummed a song he had learned from a neighbor. She noticed when he hesitated, and then, on other nights, when he did not. "He's acting strangely," Marco told the cook one morning, after the funeral when everyone was still pretending to be broken. He did not speak in alarm. He spoke in the language of someone who noticed the small pattern that suggested a bigger one. An extra car at midnight, a man who lingered by the gate to speak softly into his phone, the way certain deliveries came in unmarked crates.
The cook nodded but did not act. The cook had a life to protect. Most of the staff had a minor file of loyalty that bent toward the house that fed them, but Marco kept a list anyway. License plates, times, the unsmiling men who handed off the crates. He wrote them down on a pad he kept behind the ledger in the office drawer, as if ink could be a kind of defense. John's plan went into motion the way a theater production might, carefully rehearsed gestures, a carefully timed withdrawal. He gave interviews that were short and halting. He canceled charity appearances. He had a private physician make an appearance on a televised morning segment. The script was arranged to imply decline. The town obliged its role. People who had never spoken to him before wept when he left rooms. The cameras loved the silhouette of a man who had been chewed up by fate. Stella and Mark circulated among the condolence camps, smiling in a manner that smacked of terrorist conquest. They sat at the edges of gatherings and let people tell them how tragic it was. What the public saw was a man losing ground. What John saw was a map burning slowly to reveal the foundations below. As he practiced his cough and his slow movements, he and Isabella rehearsed the small signals that would mean now and not yet. He would let a day be public and then private. He would stand at the edge of a room and say simple, heartbreaking things to a camera. She would hide in the house and listen. They would pretend that they could be separate. One night, after Stella and Mark had left the dining room into the shimmering privacy of advantage, Isabella overheard them again. She listened from the servants' stair, a vantage that gave her the feel of watches being wound. The two of them talked as if the house itself were a ledger to be balanced. "We can't let him live to complicate this," Mark said, in a voice that had been honed in business rooms and nothing softer. "Once he regains his footing, he will come for everything." "We have to slow it," Stella replied. There was a flicker of anxiety at the edges of the way she spoke, as if even the most disciplined plan sometimes needed tending. "No one will suspect a natural decline. He'll be distracted by his grief. He'll stop asking questions." Isabella had felt the walls close at that phrase, "no one will suspect." It meant the quiet work of making a life uninteresting enough to be gutted and then sold. It meant making grief into a filter that sorted who was worthy of caring and who was not. She thought of the bracelet in her hands, its dents catching the light. She thought of the man who would wear a coat against rain and be called tragic. She thought of the small ledger of names Marco kept. When she told John what she had heard, he sat at the small kitchen table and pressed his fingers against his temples until a bruise-colored map appeared before her eyes. The plan terrorized him the way a winter storm terrorizes someone who has no shelter.
But fear did not last in him the way it had before. He was, by temperament and by necessity, a planner. He began to divide the work, who to call, what evidence might be available, what witnesses could be relied upon, where recordings might exist. They made lists like people preparing for a long winter. Isabella became their hardest, most secret asset, the only person who had listened to the people they planned to reveal. "He means everything to you," Marco had once said, while handing John his coat. The statement was so obvious it did not require elaboration. John looked at Marco that moment with a kind of quiet desperation and gratitude that did not announce itself to others. Marco's face was a plain map of patience. He had, in simple ways, been protective all along. He watched Stella's hands one day as she handled a letter and noticed a tremor she did not intend to show. He noticed things like that. He had come to know that attention sometimes saved lives. They began to build their net. John kept his face in the papers, but let it be a face that invited pity more than suspicion. Isabella began, under secret hours, to make contact with people who had once loved her. The house, which had once been a prison of smooth surfaces, began to develop small fissures. A neighbor offered a place to hide. A gardener admitted to seeing men near the gates at odd hours. Each little admission was a threat. The plan required collection, of statements, of recordings, of receipts. Each item was a piece of a mirror that would one day be held up to Stella and Mark. Stella moved in tight orbits, consolidating control in the fashion of people who prefer certainty. She took charge of the charities. She wrote letters in John's name that asked for certain changes to trust funds. She answered questions with a generosity of sorrow that disguised a precision of purpose. Mark took care of the ledger. He handled the business, the men with thicker hands who slipped between state offices and private deals. He had friends in places where conversations could be edited to their advantage. Not everyone in the house was complicit. Some staff held small rebellions of conscience. Some folded their eyes away and said nothing. Marco did not speak often. He preferred action. He began, in his unobtrusive way, to double-check deliveries and to note faces in his pad that did not belong. Once he marked a license number down and then crossed it out again because he did not know what to do with the knowledge. He wrote it anyway. Habit could be the kind of prayer that saved you. He folded his work into leaking shadows. The week before the last public performance, the funeral that would mark the culmination of the deception, John and Isabella met at night in a room that smelled of linen cleaner and old paper. They spoke in direct sentences. They rehearsed the look of finality he would let the world see. He would stand in the center of the great room and speak the words of a man broken by grief.
He would take the stage the way actors do, with a costume and a rehearsed inability to stand. "Will it feel wrong?" he asked her once, "to ask them to watch a lie?" She looked at him as though the question was ridiculous. "We will not lie about the harm," she said. "We will lie about the moment. We will use their assumptions to show what they could not see. When the time comes, they will reveal themselves." They planned how to bring the staff into their confidence. Who could be trusted to play along? Who had to be kept in the dark for their safety? Who might already have been bought? They talked about small precautions, secret compartments, locked drawers, a planned route to meet after the show. They agreed on a single word that would mean immediate retreat. They tested glances and practiced stillness like soldiers learning to breathe in unison. The day of the funeral arrived like a blackout. Black ribbons, black cloth, black eyes. The house opened its doors to a town ready to grieve. Stella stood near the front and let people come to her as if she were kin in distress. Mark moved through the crowd and nodded with the complacent confidence of someone counting his ransom. John spoke once, in a voice that was brittle and quiet, and the cameras leaned forward as if hearing paper tearing. There was applause, steady and ritualized. There were people who had never offered him loyalty, who now offered condolence. There were accusations in soft tongues that would turn into testimony later. He was a good man, people said, as if that was a sufficient epitaph. At the edge of the ceremony, near the row where press stood muffled behind their lenses, Marco kept his distance with the competence of someone doing his job. He handed over keys, he smoothed coats, he guided the bereaved with a gentle, invisible hand. He watched more carefully than he revealed, and what he saw added to his pad. A delivery truck that arrived earlier than expected. A man who carried a case in a way that made him look like a mover rather than a mourner. A license plate that matched the one he had seen written down a week earlier. An hour later, when the crowd thinned and the town began to fold itself up and go home, a white van rolled slowly up the lane and paused in a place that made no sense. It idled while two men rifled through cases. One carried a child-sized blanket. The other checked a phone like someone cross-checking a schedule. Marco's hand tightened around the keys he held. His training, long practice in doing the unnoticed thing, flashed into readiness. He had no authority, not in the legal sense. He had no badge that would command police to his side. But he had knowledge of the house, knowledge of the patterns people did not see. He had a small friend in the town sheriff who answered his calls when the schedule allowed. He had the advantage of being the only person who could move through the property without creating alarm. He stepped forward.
On the terrace, after the last guest had walked away and Stella had finally allowed herself a private smile, John closed his eyes and let himself be, for the fleeting moment, the man the rest of the town believed him to be. He let the world feel like a grave. In the house, Isabella sat and watched the windows. She felt the weight of an idea, that the plan had to be precise, because careless plans were what Caroline at the plant had called accidents that become tragedies. She listened for the small sounds of the house that meant the world had not yet broken entirely. Marco walked toward the van as if it was merely a vehicle in his route. He had no plan beyond the small irritations that made men stop and turn. He looped around the car to check the license plate again, to make certain the number matched the entry in his pad. He had practiced courtesy long enough to include confrontation as a simple chore. The man in the van noticed him and smiled with a politeness that did not reach his eyes. "Hey," he said, "we're just dropping off the gear. Estate requested some items be moved to the vault." Marco's voice was flat. "I wasn't told anything about a vault," he said. "I'm in charge of the grounds. Who's your contact?" The man gave a name. Marco checked his pad and felt a small alarm. The name did not belong on any list he knew. He could have shrugged and let it go. He had done that before and the world had not changed. He had also once seen a pattern and saved a child from an accident by calling a single number on a whim. He had, in his quiet way, lived by the idea that the small notice might prevent large sorrow. "Hold up a minute," Marco said. He put the keys into the lock of a nearby gate and turned them slowly. The sound of metal against metal was an unremarkable noise in the house, the sort of domestic clink people ignored. For 2 minutes he held the gate. The driver cursed under his breath and checked his phone. Time lengthened the way rehearsals lengthen. The man's patience thinned to a visible thread. Back in the house, Isabella did not know what had been happening on the terrace. No one in the drawing room had noticed the small man with the keys. Marco's delay was the smallest possible thing, a courtesy that created a sliver of time. But time is often a currency in which safety is bought. Marco had no idea if he had delayed the right vehicle or the wrong one. He only knew that his hand had moved because some small voice in him had told him to. When Stella's private phone buzzed, she laughed in a tiny private way and reached for it without breaking the performance. Mark rose to check the gate. In the hall, a maid fumbled with an envelope. In the kitchen, a cook put away plates. The house moved in its small choreography of indifference. Outside, the van's engine continued to tick. Marco's collar was damp with sweat. His hands felt the edge of responsibility like an awkward new ring.
John, in the study, folded the bracelet into his palm like a talisman. Isabella watched the clock on the mantel. The plan, meticulous and terrifying, was a map of small contingencies. If any of its points failed, the whole effort might unravel. In the end, it came down to small things. A gate held for a minute, a conversation overheard at the right time, a man who had nothing to gain by noticing and everything to lose if he failed to act. The funeral had ended. The house closed its doors. The town assumed business as usual would return. But in the margins, where attention thinned and the small things lived, a valet held a gate, and a girl listened to the sound of a father who still could not believe he had been saved twice by the same life. It was the beginning of a dangerous week. There would be a day of looking, of lawyers and forms, of corners where the light did not reach, and a day where the public performance would be the stage for a private consequence. Systems would be put into motion that neither grief nor cunning could stop. Men would come and go. The house would crack a little under the pressure, and someone who had always been paid to be invisible would choose, in a small way, to be otherwise. If this story is pulling at you, stay with it. There is more to come, and the smallest acts will make the largest differences. They locked themselves into the plan like swimmers lining up at the edge of a cold pool. John practiced the part of a man defeated. Isabella practiced the art of being unseen in plain sight. Stella sharpened her charity pitches. Mark balanced accounts in the dead hours. Marco kept writing down license plates. Each of them believed they had the advantage that mattered. On the morning the estate announced a private memorial before probate proceedings began, visitors came with flowers and condolences and cameras. Reporters had their notebooks ready for the man who had lost everything. The town prepared to watch a man die on paper and sign away the right to ask how it had happened. The house opened like a theater. Out at the end of the lane, the same white van returned, idling like a patient animal. 2 men stepped out, blinking against the light. One of them carried a crate. They moved as if they would be unnoticed by a world that preferred the broad script of mourning to the small, difficult work of suspicion. They moved as if the world would let them. Marco tightened his fingers around his keys. Inside, John adjusted his color and let his voice crack into the way the world would accept. Isabella sat where a daughter might be expected to sit, small and pale, a living photograph of tragedy. Stella presided like a queen at the edge of a funeral pyre, smiling as a woman who believed she had already taken what was hers. Marco glanced at the license plate, then at the men loading the case. He took one breath and stepped into the strip of sun where their shadows met. He had no plan beyond asking a question. He had no title in law. He had, however, the most durable thing that sometimes stands against calculated cruelty: attention. He knocked on the side of the van, small and ordinary. The men turned. Their eyes ran like quick knives over the man. For a moment nothing happened, only the world smelling slightly of rain. Then one of the men smiled in a way that made the air taste sour. "Everything all right?" Marco asked, as if he were asking about the weather. "It's fine," the man said. "Who's your contact?" Marco asked again, gently, and in his pocket his fingers closed on the tiny pad where he'd written the number that did not belong. He had no authority to hold them. He had only the inconvenient facility of being in the place where small actions mattered. The man's smile tightened the way a rope tightens around a throat. "We're just moving equipment," he said. Marco tilted his head, a gesture half curiosity, half door. He had no idea what they were moving. He only had the list of things that did not belong in a household of mourning. He had the quiet knowledge that sometimes the smallest delays unravel the most precise conspiracies. Behind him, the house carried on with its grief. The world had not yet understood that grief can be shaped to any purpose. Somewhere inside, a bracelet lay against a weathered palm, and the man who thought he had lost his child watched the final scenes of a drama he had crafted himself, with the intent of exposing the hands behind the curtain. Outside in the lane, the van's engine hummed, and the day seemed to hold its breath. Marco's voice was a small sound, and the men near the van answered as if trying to be patient with an inconvenience. The moment, like a coin, had two sides. One of them would show reveal, the other conceal. Marco did not know which would be exposed. He only knew he had taken one small measure to tip the balance. He had held the gate. He had written a number down, and had kept his eyes open. Inside, Isabella felt the house tighten like a net. She did not yet know what the story would demand of her. She only knew that she had to be ready for the moment the net was lifted. She had to be somewhere safe when the world shifted. She had to be the one who would tell the story, the way it had been lived. In the rooms above, Stella checked her watch and smiled with an economy of triumph. Mark sat with a folder of documents and felt the warmth of numbers that promised a future. They believed the plans were unspooling toward the conclusion they had always wanted. They had accounted for grief and law and mourning tongues. They had not counted, perhaps, on the tiny ledger in a Valet's pocket, or a girl who had taught herself to be silent in the small hours. The white van idled. Marco held the keys. The house breathed as if waiting for someone to blow out a candle.
Outside, a phone buzzed in a pocket, an ordered cue perhaps, or a stray notification, and the van's driver checked it with a speed that had the edge of someone watching a clock. Marco felt the moment in his hands like a thermometer measuring a fever. He stepped a hair farther into sunlight, into view. He lifted his chin the way a man does when he hopes a question will be answered. Inside, John sat very still and felt the world condense. The plan he'd set would require courage from many small players. He had arranged the pieces, recordings, testimonies, a public collapse. He had set his acting like armor. He had not expected a valet to be one of the instruments. He had not expected a valet's small delay to be the sort of hinge that swung open the door to disaster or salvation. But now he felt, in the pause before the next designed moment, the weight of human attention needed to hold them up. Marco's phone, in his inside pocket, had one number memorized, a friend at the precinct who picked up when he called, and for reasons Marco would never fully explain, trusted him enough to answer in the middle of a night. He did not believe in heroics. He believed in small probabilities, and the odds looked like lines he could measure. He took his hand, half an instinct, half in habit, and tapped the number. There was no way to know if that small tap would change the arc of a week's events. There was no way to know if it would keep a child safe, or stall a crime, or simply make more complications. He only knew that he had noticed, and that his noticing had forced a choice on somebody who might have preferred to move in secrecy. The man in the van rolled his eyes. The world had long grown used to people who ask impertinent questions, and then walked away. Marco adjusted his cap, said nothing more, and waited. The day had turned thin and bright, like brittle paper. The house hummed with the ordinary tragedies of grief. The small ledger in his pocket felt heavy. He did not know what the men planned. He only knew that he had refused to be simply a background figure.
When the two men inside the van moved to brace the crate, a third figure appeared at the edge of the lane. A driver returning to his car. A neighbor pausing to take a call. None of them had authority, but all of them had a body, and bodies create obstacles. The van's engine idled and the world watched itself. Inside the study, John unfolded his hands and felt for the bracelet. In a few hours the bell would ring for a final farewell. In a few hours they would speak of loss. In a few hours a probate hearing would be scheduled and lawyers would convene. The whole of the brand hinged on a precise balance between illusion and revelation. Marco's breath fogged in the cold air. He held the keys like a conductor would hold a baton. Small actions, directing a larger orchestra. He did not believe in grandness, only in the accumulation of small, uncelebrated choices.
He had been invisible for years. He had accepted that as the cost of seeing. The van's door opened. A man stepped out and lifted the crate as if it were furniture, rather than something that might be part of a conspiracy. He blinked into the light and looked, for a fraction of a second, at Marco. There was a tiny exchange of attentions, two men reading each other for an instant, a history of every small decision each had made. "Everything okay?" the man asked, with a voice made bland by practice. "We don't want to cause a scene." "No scene," Marco said, "just making sure this is expected." The man gave a name. Marco checked his pad, felt a cold line of certainty. The name was not on any list he knew. He could have let it go. He could have been the invisible man, the one who folded back into the background and let the next event proceed. But he had already chosen. He had already called a number. His voice echoed from a pocket like an answered prayer. He had no idea his small gesture would make the difference between a child's life continuing and a story that would be forever twisted into a lie. He only knew the smallest truth. Sometimes when no one else looks, someone must. The van hummed. The gate remained closed a moment longer. The day was not yet over. The world, like a held breath, awaited the next small motion. The van eased away like a sleeping animal disturbed. Its taillights vanished around a bend before anyone at the house had time to make sense of the small alarm that had risen, and then been let go. Marco watched it go, the pad in his pocket heavy with inked numbers, and the memory of names that did not belong. He stayed long enough to lock the gate, to put keys back into their tray with a care that felt ceremonial, then walked inside as if nothing had happened. But networks have a way of carrying news. A call to a friend at the precinct did not guarantee anything, but it did put a name and a description into a place that could act. The sheriff's deputy who answered Marco's voice was half awake and half bothered. He promised to drive by and see. It was not much, and it was all Marco had. He returned to his duties while the house resumed its choreography of grief, and every small motion felt noisier for the knowledge that someone had looked. The men in the van, when they realized they had been stalled by nothing more than a man holding a gate, did what men who profit from calculation will do. They recalculated. Their schedules were tight, and an open window could be turned into an opportunity if they simply moved the point of action to the place where the people they wanted to silence would be easiest to reach. The probate hearing was public. Cameras, crowds, and the hours of procedure made a courthouse a place where someone could get lost long enough to be taken. They talked, voice low in the van, and turned the GPS toward the town square as if steering toward a new chance. John and Isabella did not know, in the hush of the house, what had just transpired on the terrace. They practiced small things instead. A nod, a look, a single word that meant fall back. The plan they had built was a brittle thing that depended on many hands keeping time. They trusted people those hands had named. They trusted that the police would notice the patterns once the evidence appeared. They trusted Marco in the way they trusted any invisible person who had given them the sense that someone was keeping watch. On the morning of probate, the town had lined itself for spectacle. The courthouse square smelled of sun and paper. Reporters folded themselves into corners and waited for anything that might become a headline. John moved like an actor who had rehearsed sorrow down to the cadence of his steps. Isabella stood beside him with the steadiness of someone who had been rehearsing silence into strength. Stella wore grief the way a woman might wear a gown that had cost a fortune, a look tailored to reaction. Marco had requested the assignment that morning in the only way he knew. He asked to drive the family car. It was a small thing, and the household agreed without thinking. He had driven them for years. His presence at the courthouse would be unremarkable. It would, in other hands, make his intervention invisible. In his hands, it would make it possible. He parked with the memory of the van in the back of his head. The town did what towns do. It filled its square with 1,000 small intentions. Men stood near the courthouse steps looking anxious in the way professional liars do. A delivery truck idled across the street, the sort of truck that did not want to attract attention.
Marco's eyes, trained for years to read a household by the way a coat fell off a chair, slid across the scene. He noticed the same license plate he had written down a week before. He noticed the way one man kept turning toward the building, as if timing mattered. He might have been invisible to cameras, but he was visible to circumstance. He moved as if performing 1,000 unimportant tasks. He adjusted a rearview mirror, he straightened the family's umbrella, he walked toward the curb with the mechanical manners of someone who had always held the weight of other people's comings and goings. When he passed the delivery truck, he made a small joke about the weather. The driver's eyes flicked to him, then away. Marco felt the weight of the moment like a hand on his back. He had no title, only the sense that the thing he had seen once was circling back. The men who had been in the van had not come simply to lift a crate. Their plan had the cold efficiency of professionals and the bluntness of people who believed violence was incidental to profit. They intended to intercept Isabella on arrival, to take her out of the public flow and into a vehicle where they could move her quickly beyond town limits.
If their first attempt had failed, they would try again where the world was most distracted, on the steps of a courthouse where procedure and pageantry gave them cover. Marco's hand closed on his phone. He did not call the sheriff this time. He had already done that and waited. He moved instead with a small theater of obstruction. He looped the key to John's car into the slot of his belt, then stepped across the street and dropped a glove at the feet of one of the men near the truck. He bent, ostensibly, to pick it up, and in that motion locked eyes with the driver. His question was small and ordinary. "Is that where you want to leave it?" The driver, a man used to hurried compliance, bristled and smiled as if to hide impatience. "Yeah, just here," the man said. "Problem with that," Marco said softly. "That's a loading zone for the courthouse. They'll ticket you. They do it quick." The man cursed in a whisper. He could have shrugged and moved. Instead, he checked his phone. 1 minute lengthened. Marco's motion was a hand on the dial of time. Across the square, a woman with a camera shifted her weight. Her lens turned toward the steps. A courthouse deputy watched the flow of people and the way a delivery truck did not seem to belong. Small things accumulate into concern. The deputy crossed the square toward the truck, partly because duty demanded it, partly because his eye had noticed the same little details Marco had. He asked for identification. The driver flapped a bill and a name. The deputy's question was casual at first, then precise. He took down the plate and made a radio call. The word suspicious moved into official channels, and with it came attention. The men in the truck tensed and shifted their plan. Isabella and John stepped up the courthouse steps. Inside, lawyers smoothed their notes. Cameras hummed like flies. John felt the world close into the ritual he had prepared. For a flickering second, he could taste the metal of his role, the actor who must be believed. Isabella stood with a steady face that was younger and older at once. She had practiced silence long enough that speech now seemed a weapon. She planned to use it like a scalpel. When the deputy radioed his suspicions, license plate, van description, men moving like people who were not simply making a delivery, the air changed. Someone at the edge of the crowd muttered. A uniform moved with purpose. It was not an army. It was a single man who had been assigned to the courthouse that morning, and who, like any good guard, noticed things. He moved across the plaza with the sort of deliberate steps people take when they want to make sure a scene does not become a tragedy. The men realized at once that their window was shrinking. They looked toward the steps where a girl in a dark coat had just passed. They cursed under their breath and made for an exit. They had counted on the tangled noise of courthouse to swallow a person.
They had not counted, perhaps, on a valet who could read the town like a book. Marco's action in the square had not been heroic. He had done what he could with what was around him, delayed a truck with a remark about parking, created the inconvenience, put a deputy in motion. He had no plan for what came next, only the conviction that noticing was a form of intervention. When the men tried to move, he stepped into the space between them and the street, as if announcing, without words, that any exit would now be more difficult. He was a small human wedge. One of the men lunged for the nearest alley. Another moved toward a waiting car. Marco planted himself like a prop in a stage set, unremarkable, and then not. He did what he always did. He became useful. He did not tussle or shout. He threw his body into something simple. He set his bag on the curb in such a way that a wheel could not pass without detaching it. It was a tiny obstruction. It forced a man to stop and handle a mundane problem. In those seconds, the deputy closed the distance. The arrest was not cinematic. There was no hand-to-hand brawl or movie-worthy chase. There was a man with the wrong papers, a radio call, and 2 officers who had come because a valet dropped a glove and because a deputy's curiosity was piqued. The men tried to claim they were contractors, then retreated into silence as their story unraveled. The deputy spoke into his radio. The truck's crate was opened and found to contain nothing of the sensitive nature they'd pretended. It was a decoy. The real plan had been to draw attention to the building as the men snatched the one child who would speak. The one thing that had stopped them was a valet's patience and a deputy's willingness to answer a call. Isabella watched the scene from the steps.
When she saw the men detained and the deputy looking toward the crowd with a satisfied sort of gravity, she felt something leave her. It was a weight that had been pressing her to the floor for months. It rose and was replaced by a different thing, adrenaline spliced with relief. For the first time in a long time, she believed that the plan they had stitched together might actually have a chance to work. The courthouse was then itself the theater of truth. The probate hearing moved forward, but not in the way the villains expected. The presence of men in custody made questions cascade. Phone records, license plates, and delivery receipts that had once been invisible became threats. John had kept his face as a mask until now. He let the mask fall in a controlled moment and produced the evidence they had built with the help of neighbors and those who still had conscience enough to speak. A prosecutor, brisk and unromantic, unfolded the files with the satisfactions of one who assembles a case like a puzzle. There were ledger entries of payments to men with shell companies. There was Stella's handwriting on letters that shifted funds.
There were recordings Isabella had hidden, small things that snagged on guilt, voices at night, a casual mention of slowing him, and the word inheritance, pronounced like a verdict. There were receipts marked for medical supplies that had nothing to do with illness. Each fragment fit like a sliver into a wider mosaic. Marco's pad became a piece of that puzzle. It was handed to a clerk with a whispered explanation. Worker at the Harrison house. Found these. Thought someone should know. The clerk looked at the neat entries, plates, times, names, and then at the deputy who had made the arrests across the square. The deputy peered at the numbers and then at the paperwork from the house. He made a note. The world took the small ledger seriously because, in the end, the law listens to accumulation. Many small facts stacked until they make a shape. Stella's composure began to thin. Mark's courage, which had the quality of people who had always bled others dry without consequence, started to crack. Their faces became an open page for the cameras. When the prosecutor played the clipped audio, voices speaking candidly, assuming privacy, their words floating like a confession, the room shifted and leaned forward. The tapes were not dramatic. They were ordinary talk, the kind that kills in slow ways. Let him sleep. Let the disease do the rest. We can finalize the papers. The plaintive normalcy of the words made them worse. John did not gloat. He had practiced a face for the moment, and that face was not triumph. It was a man's face who had been to the edge of losing everything and had chosen to step from it with a plan. He sat and watched as the particulars fell into place. Isabella gave her testimony with a voice that was steady and unadorned. She spoke of windows and hallways, of a small life lived under watch, of the names she had learned like a list of traitors. Her story was precise in the way suffering teaches. The judge listened as if he weighed each sentence. He saw the ledger entries, the recordings, the truck's registration, the men who had been detained outside the courthouse by the decision of one man to ask a small question. The prosecutor moved with the dispassion of a craftsman. At the end of the morning, Stella and Mark were led from the gallery in handcuffs. Cameras crowded them, their smiles were gone. The town that had once watched their performance now watched the unraveling. It was not instant justice. There were processes yet to come, courts to convene, lawyers to argue. But the immediate moment was clear. The plan John had nested in the theater of his own decline had worked. The lie that had been dressed as mourning had been stripped away and found wanting. Isabella's voice, supported by paper, audio, and the lip of a valet's pad, had made the difference. After the courthouse emptied and the journalists began to archive the scene into articles, John stepped out into a narrow courtyard where the light felt small and private.
He found Marco near the curb, leaning against the hood of the car, as if that was the only place he was allowed to breathe. The public, hungry for spectacle, missed the exchange. Only a few near the steps looked on. John walked across with a slow gait and extended a hand. "Marco," he said simply. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. There were 1,000 ways to thank someone, and a handshake was one that held weight. Marco took the hand like a man who had been given an unexpected thing. He had not expected recognition. He had not made his choices seeking it. His palms were rough and honest. John put something into his hand, a small envelope. Marco glanced at it, and then at the man's face, and nodded. Gratitude can be private, and sometimes it is enough. There were other acknowledgments. A deputy who had been involved asked Marco quietly for a full statement. A clerk sent a note of thanks, but Marco did not stand on any stage.
He returned to his car, to the ordinary work of returning coats and handing over keys. He remained, as ever, a man comfortable in the background. Home felt both unfamiliar and exactly as it had been. The house was quieter now that the engines of conspiracy had been exposed. People who had been polite in tragedy now avoided the family like a stain. Some staff left, others stayed because they could not imagine going anywhere else. John and Isabella walked their rooms like people relearning a house that had been built around a lie. They opened drawers. They took back what had been taken. Isabella moved slowly through a bedroom that still smelled faintly of lavender and bleach and put her hand on the windowsill as if testing memory. There was one thing left to do that felt less like a legal victory and more like a private exorcism. The gravestone that had stood in the town cemetery, an artful lie the conspirators had raised as a testament, hung in the air between them. It had been set with ceremonies and had the town's tears lacquered into its surface. For John, the stone had been an instrument of both pain and necessary deception. For Isabella, it had been a thing that had pretended to be final when nothing about their story had been final. They went back to the cemetery not to hold another funeral, but to perform an undoing. It was not a spectacle. They went in the soft hour before dusk when the cameras had left and the grass smelled clean. The gravestone loomed gray and sure. John touched its surface and felt the bruise it had left upon him. He looked at Isabella and saw that same mixture of sorrow and new strength that had held her in the months they had planned. "We'd never bury the truth," she said, and it was not a triumph, but an honest thing. Together they took hammer, not in anger but in the quiet, ritual way people use a tool to mark an end. The first blow was not loud. It was an assertion. Stone flaked. The second struck cleaner.
The third sent a fragment of the false epitaph skittering into the grass like a small, defeated thing. They worked until the name was broken enough that it could no longer be read as an authority. When they finished, they sat on the grass and let the silence hold them. The world had not gone back to what it was. There were wounds that would take a long time to fade. There would be trials and legal tedium. There would be things that could not be put right. But the act of breaking the stone felt like saying out loud that no one could perform a dead child's life into neat absolution. They had taken the symbol and shown it for what it was, a prop. Marco watched from the car as they left the cemetery. He did not approach. He had been thanked. That was enough. Some people carry their good acts like stones in their pockets and never let them see the light. Marco folded his pad into his inside pocket, wiped his palms on his trousers, and returned to the house to do the small things that he understood better than most: keep a life moving. Weeks later, the town had new things to talk about. News cycles have short memories. But the people who mattered to John and Isabella remembered. They remembered the deputy who had answered a call. They remembered the neighbors who had come forward. They remembered the valet who had been the difference between a plan flourishing and a plan failing. The legal tides moved. Stella and Mark faced charges. The estate was put under oversight. Justice, which in small towns is often a slow and awkward machine, began a process that would, with time, find its courses.
But the things that matter to people who live with long quietness are small recognitions given and kept. Marco left the table with a plate he had cleared and a note in his pocket that read simply, "With gratitude." Isabella slipped an envelope into his hand as she passed. It was something practical and something personal. He opened it later and found not only money, more than he would have taken, but also a handwritten card that said, "Thank you for seeing me." The invisible thing had been made visible, briefly, in the only way that kept dignity intact: a private gratitude. Marco did not seek fame. He left no interviews. He returned to the work he had always done. But when he walked by the cemetery, he sometimes paused at a spot where a fragment of a stone lay among the grass. He picked it up once and slid it into his pocket, as if to carry a small weight for a friend. The years that followed were not clean. There were court dates and statements, and at times the slow resentment that is the aftertaste of being betrayed by those closest. There were moments when John would close his eyes and feel the absence of the illusion he had lived for the sake of revealing truth. There were nights when Isabella would wake from a dream that still smelled like the house she had left behind. Healing never arrived all at once. It arrived in the small gestures that refill the ledger of a life. Dinners kept, rooms made safe, laughter that returns a note at a time. In the end, what held them together was not a single victory. It was the accumulation of small, unremarkable acts. A valet who noticed a plate, a neighbor who refused to stay silent, a daughter who remembered names, a father who chose to perform grief in order to expose a crime. The legal system did its work. The town watched and then went back to its other concerns. But inside a house on a lane that smelled of lemon cleaner, a family found itself again. On a late afternoon, some months after the trials began, John and Isabella returned to the foot of a different marker in the cemetery. This time they did not carry a hammer, but a small stack of flowers, some tools left as a gesture rather than instrument. They set the flowers down and sat together. They spoke in low voices, plans for mornings that would include coffee, a promise to enroll Isabella in a class she had wanted, a note to a gardener to plant something that would not be easily broken. When they left the cemetery, there was no fanfare. The story that had once been built on lies and silence had been reframed by testimony and ordinary courage. The valet went back to his routines. The deputy returned to patrol. The town persisted amid small rituals. The invisible hero remained, in truth, mostly invisible. But in the quiet places, the handshake, the envelope, the card in a pocket, his courage had a life that the cameras did not capture. It was a modest currency, but it bought time and it bought another morning.
If you stayed through this story, if the way small things sometimes change a life makes sense to you, consider seeing more like it. Subscribe, and you'll find stories where attention matters and ordinary people make the difference.